It all started with an envelope. Not just any envelope. This one was a specific shade of beige, a color I like to call crushed dreams and weak tea. It had the stiff, self-important feel of cheap cardstock trying desperately to pass as something luxurious. And, in the top left corner, printed in a font that screamed, "We have meetings about fonts," were the words that could curdle milk from 50 paces. Crestwood Bluffs Homeowners Association. You know the type of neighborhood. The kind where every blade of grass is expected to stand at attention. Every mailbox must adhere to a strict code of unassuming mediocrity. And every creative impulse is smothered under a thick, beige blanket of conformity. I'd bought my house here because it was close to my sister. And I'm a good brother who also happens to enjoy a good deal on a mortgage. I hadn't realized I was also signing up to live in a suburban panopticon managed by a board of people whose hobbies included laminated rule books and measuring their neighbors' shrubbery. I stood there at my mailbox, the metal door still hanging open like a dumbstruck mouth, and I knew. I didn't even have to open it. I knew who was behind this. Her name was Carol Peterson. Carol lived next door in a house so immaculately beige it blended into the sky on an overcast day. She was the self-appointed guardian of Crestwood Bluffs, the neighborhood watch, the welcome wagon, and the secret police all rolled into one visor-wearing, binocular-wielding package. Think of a human surveillance drone powered by decaf coffee and passive aggression, and you're halfway there. In the year I'd lived here, I had become Carol's personal Vietnam. My crimes were numerous and, in her eyes, unforgivable. There was the great wind chime incident of last May, where my bamboo chimes were cited for producing unharmonious and frankly exotic tonal intrusions. There was the welcome mat violation in July, when my welcome nerds doormat was deemed to have an unapproved and exclusionary message. My personal favorite was the time I saw her, through my kitchen window, kneeling on my lawn with an actual ruler, measuring the grass near the driveway. The subsequent notice informed me that 3% of my lawn exceeded the regulation 3.5-inch height limit. But this felt different. This beige envelope had a weight to it, a sinister gravity. With a sigh that came from the depths of my soul, I tore it open. The language inside was a work of art. If your idea of art is soul-crushing corporate jargon, it was a symphony of whereas, heretofore, and in accordance with. I skimmed through the verbal sludge until my eyes landed on the subject line. Notice of violation. Bylaw 7, Section 4, Paragraph C. Unpermitted auxiliary structures. My heart sank. My unpermitted auxiliary structure. The fortress of splinters. The one and only thing in my yard that wasn't beige, my treehouse. The letter went on to inform me, in no uncertain terms, that the structure, built for my 8-year-old niece, Penny, was a blight upon the architectural cohesion of the community and a potential liability. I had 30 days. 30 days to dismantle and remove all materials associated with the structure or face a fine of $50 per day. $50 a day for a treehouse. I did the math in my head. That was $1,500 a month. I could rent a small, depressing apartment for that. Apparently, in Crestwood Bluffs, providing a place for your niece to host tea parties for her stuffed bears was a crime on par with running a speakeasy. I crumpled the letter in my fist, the cheap cardstock crackling in protest. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over me. I wasn't just annoyed. I was furious. I stormed inside, pulled out my phone, and stabbed at the screen until I found the contact I needed. It rang twice. "Dave's Demolition and Deliverance," a laid-back voice answered. "You break it, I take it." "They did it, Dave," I said, pacing my living room like a caged tiger. "The beige-clad witch finally did it. She's coming for the Fortress of Splinters." There was a low whistle on the other end. "No way. Carol, what's it this time? Is the Treehouse casting an unseemly shadow on her prize-winning petunias?" "Worse. It's an illegal structure." "Illegal?" I practically shouted into the phone. "You'd think I was running a meth lab out of it, not letting Penny pretend she's the queen of a magical kingdom. It's a violation of architectural cohesion." This coming from a woman whose entire house is the color of a manila folder. "Dude, that's rough," Dave said, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. He loved this stuff. As a construction manager, he dealt with petty bureaucrats all day, but he found my personal war with the HOA endlessly entertaining. "So what are you gonna do? You can't just take it down. Penny would be devastated." He was right. That was the core of it. This wasn't about a pile of wood in my old oak tree. This was about my niece. After my sister's divorce last year, Penny had been having a tough time. That treehouse was my project to give her a little slice of magic, a safe place that was all her own. It was a sanctuary built of 2x4s, cheap deck screws, and a whole lot of love. Seeing her up there, laughing with her friends, had been one of the purest joys of my life. And Carol wanted to bulldoze it because it didn't match her curtains. I walked to my back window and looked out at it. The Fortress of Splinters. It wasn't a masterpiece of carpentry by any means. A few of the boards were a little crooked, and the roof had a slight, jaunty tilt to it. But it was sturdy, it was safe, and it was ours. A pirate flag, drawn by Penny in crayon and laminated at a copy shop, fluttered from the top. A cold, hard certainty settled in my chest. Carol had made a critical error. She thought she was just picking a fight with me, the guy with the nerdy welcome mat. She didn't realize she was picking a fight with the guy who would do absolutely anything to make his niece happy. She'd started this war. She'd cited her bylaws and her paragraphs. She wanted to play by the rules. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet," I told Dave, my voice dangerously calm. "But I know this. It is on. She wants to play by the rules? We can play by the rules. We're going to play so hard she'll wish she'd just complained about my recycling bin again." The war for the Fortress of Splinters had begun. You can't fully appreciate the declaration of a suburban war without understanding the territory being fought over. The Fortress of Splinters wasn't just some prefabricated kit I'd ordered online. Oh no. It was a testament to my ambition, Dave's grudging expertise, and the limitless optimism of an 8-year-old girl with a box of crayons and a vision. The project had started a year ago, on a Saturday morning that smelled of fresh-cut grass and opportunity. I'd just bought the house, and Penny, who was staying with me for the weekend, was exploring the backyard. Her eyes, wide and serious, fixated on the giant oak tree that dominated the lawn. "Uncle Leo," she'd said, with the gravity only a child can muster, "that tree needs a castle." And who was I to argue with that? What followed was a glorious montage of well-intentioned incompetence. Our blueprints were a series of crayon drawings Penny made, which featured a slide, a rock-climbing wall, and a special room for her pet hamster, Sir Reginald Fluffington. We compromised. I nixed the hamster room. Building codes, you know, but promised a pulley system for hoisting up snacks. The next few weekends were a blur of Home Depot trips. I learned the difference between a lag bolt and a carriage bolt. I discovered that pressure-treated lumber is much, much heavier than it looks. Dave, a saint in a tool belt, came over to make sure my creation wouldn't immediately collapse, killing us all. "You're putting the support joists how far apart?" he'd ask, rubbing his temples as if trying to physically prevent a migraine. "Leo, that's not a floor. That's a trampoline waiting to happen." I handled the sawing. He handled the structural integrity. Penny was our project manager, wearing a plastic pink hard hat and handing us screws, often the wrong ones, with unwavering confidence. There were smashed thumbs, mine, Crooked cuts, also mine, and more than one instance of me nearly falling off a ladder. But slowly, painfully, a structure began to emerge from the chaos. The day we finished, we hoisted Penny's hand-drawn pirate flag up the makeshift flagpole. We inaugurated the pulley system by sending up a bucket of cookies. Seeing her face, absolutely incandescent with joy as she surveyed her new kingdom, made every splinter and sore muscle worth it. The Fortress of Splinters was more than a treehouse. It was a repository of happy memories. And Carol wanted to turn it into a pile of firewood. Before escalating things, I decided to try one last, desperate act of diplomacy, the adult approach, the kill-her-with-kindness method. I baked a coffee cake, my secret weapon, loaded with a truly irresponsible amount of cinnamon streusel, and marched over to the beige palace next door. She answered the door wearing her battle visor, even though she was indoors. Her expression was one of mild surprise, as if a wild animal had just appeared on her doorstep offering pastries. "Hey, Carol," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Brought you some coffee cake. Listen, about that letter." She eyed the cake in its glass dish with deep suspicion. "Oh, Leo, is that cinnamon? My Gerald is sensitive to airborne spices. It's a community consideration. I swear to God, airborne spices." "Right. Well, I can just leave it here," I said, placing it on her porch stoop. "Anyway, I just wanted to talk, neighbor to neighbor, about the treehouse. It's for my niece. It's safe. I had a professional look at it. It's not an eyesore." Carol crossed her arms, her posture stiffening. "Rules are the bedrock of a harmonious community, Leo," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Without rules, we have anarchy. We have unpermitted auxiliary structures. We have exotic wind chimes." "It's a place for a little girl to play," I pleaded. "Can't there be some kind of exception?" "The bylaws are absolute," she said, her eyes gleaming with the righteous fury of the truly petty. "It's a matter of property value, integrity, and architectural cohesion. My Gerald and I have already called an emergency board meeting for Tuesday night. You can present your case then." She gave a thin, reptilian smile and closed the door, leaving me and my airborne spices on her porch. So much for diplomacy. Tuesday night I walked into Carol's garage, which had been converted into a makeshift courtroom. 5 folding chairs were arranged facing a long table, where the HOA board sat in judgment. Carol, of course, was the president. The other 4 members looked like they had been sourced from a casting call for Board Retiree #1 through #4. There was a man who seemed to be asleep, a woman knitting a beige scarf, and 2 others who just stared blankly at the wall. I came prepared. I had my speech rehearsed. I had a folder with photos of Penny laughing in the treehouse. I had a signed letter from Dave attesting to its structural soundness. I even had a printout of 5 other nearby treehouses that were clearly visible from the street, none of which had been cited. I made my case with all the passion I could muster. I talked about family, about creating joy for a child, about the spirit of a community versus the letter of its laws. I passed around the photos. The knitting woman glanced at one and murmured, "Oh, how sweet," before returning to her yarn. The sleeping man snorted softly. Then it was Carol's turn. She stood up and dimmed the garage lights. A projector whirred to life, beaming a presentation onto the garage door. The title slide read, "A Deep Dive into Bylaw 7, Maintaining Crestwood's Aesthetic and Financial Integrity." For the next 20 minutes, Carol subjected us to the most soul-crushing PowerPoint presentation I have ever witnessed. There were slides with aerial photos of my property, a red circle drawn crudely around the treehouse. There were slides with highlighted sections of the HOA covenant, full of intimidating legal phrases. Slide 7 was titled Line of Sight Infringement Analysis, and it featured a diagram showing how the treehouse was visible from her second-story bathroom window, which she claimed disrupted her morning tranquility. She spoke without emotion, her voice a monotone drone of rules and regulations. She concluded by saying that granting me an exception would open the floodgates to all manner of unapproved structures, from tool sheds to, and I quote, flamboyant gazebos. When she finished, she turned on the lights and looked at the board. All in favor of upholding the violation notice? 4 hands went up immediately, Carol's, the knitting woman's, and the 2 blank-faced ones. The sleeping man stirred, looked around in confusion, and then slowly raised his hand too. It was unanimous. "The board has voted," Carol announced, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "The violation stands. Mr. Martinez, you have until the end of the 30-day period to comply." I was stunned into silence. I had tried to be reasonable. I had tried to appeal to their humanity. And in return, I got a PowerPoint presentation about morning tranquility. I gathered my photos and my useless documents, my face burning with humiliation. As I walked out of the garage and into the night air, I heard Carol's voice, low and smug, speaking to the knitting woman. "Some people," she said, "just need to learn that the rules apply to everyone." And that was it. That was the moment the switch flipped. The reasonable, coffee-cake-baking Leo died in that garage. In his place stood a man who now had one singular purpose on this earth: to find Carol's precious rulebook and beat her over the head with it. Metaphorically, of course. Mostly. The next 2 days were a blur of defeated misery. I broke the news to Penny over the phone, and her heartbroken little voice was like a knife in my gut. I promised her we'd build something else, something even better, but the words felt hollow. I spent my evenings on the couch, surrounded by pizza boxes and empty beer bottles, scrolling through websites for demolition services. The ads were depressingly cheerful. "Making space for something new?" one chirped. I wasn't making space for something new. I was surrendering a piece of my heart to the Beige Brigade. Dave came over on the second night, taking in the scene of my squalor with a sympathetic wince. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat down next to me. "Wow, it looks like a college student's cry for help in here," he said, kicking a pizza box. "You doing okay?" "Just peachy," I grumbled into a couch cushion. "I'm currently getting quotes to tear down a child's sanctuary. One guy offered to do it for $500 and a free t-shirt. I'm thinking of taking him up on it, just so I have something to wear to Carol's funeral after my spirit dies completely." "Come on, man, don't give up," Dave said, clapping me on the shoulder. "We can't let her win. We gotta fight back." "How?" "She used a PowerPoint presentation against me, Dave. A PowerPoint. She has the entire beige army on her side. I'm just one guy with a nerdy welcome mat." "So we can't fight her head on," he mused, taking a long pull from his beer. "We have to be smarter. We need to think like her. We need petty revenge." This piqued my interest. I sat up. "I'm listening?" Okay, he said, leaning forward, his eyes alight with the thrill of the scheme. "What if you replace the treehouse with something equally annoying, but technically legal? You could put up a gnome army. 100 garden gnomes, all painted in fluorescent colors, all staring directly at her house." I considered it. The image was beautiful, tempting, so tempting. But she'd just find a bylaw against excessive ceramic congregation, or unapproved mythical creatures. "All right. What about a flagpole? A massive 50-foot flagpole. And you just fly a different, increasingly ridiculous flag every day. A rubber chicken, a slice of pizza, a portrait of Nicolas Cage. I like where your head's at, but again, there's probably a height restriction." I sighed, slumping back into the couch. Her rulebook is a fortress, man. There's no way in. Dave went quiet for a moment, staring at the ceiling. A slow grin spread across his face. "Maybe we don't have to break into the fortress," he said. "Maybe she left a door unlocked." He leaned in. his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You need to find a loophole. Something they can't touch. Something that's in the rules. It's the ultimate move. Malicious compliance. What are the exact rules on temporary structures? The phrase hung in the air between us. Temporary structures. It was like a lightning bolt to my brain. The fog of my despair evaporated, replaced by a manic, glorious energy. I scrambled off the couch, nearly tripping over a pizza box, and ran to my office. On my desk, under a pile of mail, was the welcome packet I'd received when I moved in, and inside it, weighing approximately 10 pounds, was the sacred text itself. The Crestwood Bluffs HOA Covenant, Conditions and Restrictions. For the next hour, Dave watched in amused silence as I hunched over the 300-page document like a monk deciphering an ancient scroll. It was a journey into the heart of suburban darkness. There were rules about trash can placement, rules about basketball hoop colors, rules about the acceptable decibel level of wind chimes, so that's where she got me. It was a masterpiece of micromanagement. And then on page 247, I found it. Article 9, Section 2, Temporary Structures. My heart hammered in my chest as I read the dense paragraph. It stated that homeowners were not allowed to erect any permanent sheds, gazebos, or other outbuildings without approval. However, it went on to say that non-permanent temporary structures for the purpose of social gatherings, private events, or seasonal coverings were permitted. And here was the kicker, the golden ticket. Such temporary structures did not require board approval as long as they were removed within 90 days. 90 days. I read it again, and then a third time, making sure I wasn't hallucinating. It was real. It was right there, in black and white. A loophole. A beautiful, glorious, carol-sized loophole. I looked up at Dave, a slow, unhinged grin spreading across my face. I've got it. What'd you find? They can't stop me from putting up a temporary structure for a private event. Okay. So you put up a little party tent, like a 10 by 10 pop-up, that'll show her, he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. No, I said, my mind racing, the idea blossoming from a seed into a monstrous, beautiful flower. You're thinking too small, my friend. We're not going for a polite little nudge. We're going for a full-scale psychological assault, not a party tent, a wedding marquee. Getting warmer, Dave said, catching on. My fingers flew across my keyboard. I typed extra-large temporary event structures for rent into the search bar. My eyes scanned the results. And then I saw it. An ad with flashing colors and a font that looked like it belonged on a carnival poster. The ad was for a company called Big Top Bonanza Rentals. And the picture. Oh, the picture was magnificent. It was a circus tent. A full-blown, honest-to-God, red and yellow-striped, 3-ring circus tent. It was perfect. It was massive. It was gaudy. It was obnoxious. And technically, legally, according to their own ridiculous rules, it was a temporary structure for a private event. Oh my God, Dave whispered, peering over my shoulder at the screen. You wouldn't? Oh, I would, I said, grabbing my phone. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a giddy sense of righteous purpose. The era of the reasonable, coffee-cake-baking Leo was officially over. The era of the spite circus tent-renting Leo had just begun. I found the number and dialed, putting the phone on speaker. A gravelly voice answered. Big Top Bonanza, Gus speaking. I cleared my throat, trying to sound as normal as possible. Hi, yes. I need to know your availability for, let's see. I looked at the options on the website. A 40-foot, red and yellow striped big top tent. There was a pause on the other end. A 40-footer? For a residential property? Gus asked, his voice full of disbelief. That's right. Son, you sure you got the right number? This ain't for no backyard barbecue. This is for, a circus. I'm sure, I said, locking eyes with Dave, who was now silently weeping with laughter. It's for a very, very long birthday party. For my niece. Before I could build my monument to malicious compliance, I had to tear down my monument to love. It was the honorable thing to do. I had to comply with the letter of the law before I could start gleefully violating its spirit. I found a small, local demolition crew online with a no-nonsense name, Sal's Hauling and Removal. A guy named Sal showed up the next morning, a mountain of a man with a graying mustache and hands like catcher's mitts. He walked into the backyard, took one look at the treehouse, and then looked at me. Shame to take this down, kid, he grunted, his voice a low rumble. He walked over to the oak tree and knocked on one of the support beams with his knuckles. The sound was solid and reassuring. Good joints. You built this yourself? Yeah, I said, a lump forming in my throat. With a friend. It's for my niece. Sal nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the neighboring houses. He squinted at Carol's beige fortress. HOA, huh? You have no idea. A grim smile touched his lips. Bunch of vampires. Had one tell me my work truck was aesthetically displeasing once. I parked it in front of her house for a week. Told her I forgot I left it there. I liked Sal immediately. He understood. He wasn't just a demolition guy. He was a fellow soldier in the great suburban wars. He and his crew worked with a surprising gentleness, carefully dismantling the fortress of splinters board by board. I'd asked them to be careful. I wanted to save the wood. Every piece of it held a memory. The deck where Penny and I had counted stars, the wall with the faint crayon marks from her blueprints, the roof that had sheltered us during a sudden summer rain shower. As they worked, I called Penny and explained. I told her the treehouse had to go away for a little while, but that I was planning a huge surprise for her. Something even better. She was sad, but the promise of a surprise was enough to placate her. Is it a bouncy castle? She'd asked, her voice full of hope. Something like that, I'd said, but bigger. By the end of the day, the oak tree stood bare. The lawn was clear, save for a neat stack of lumber by the side of the house. It was a sad, empty sight. Carol was practically glowing with smug satisfaction, watching from her window. Little did she know she wasn't witnessing an ending. She was witnessing a metamorphosis. The chrysalis of my revenge was complete. Now it was time for the butterfly, a giant, gaudy, red and yellow-striped butterfly, to emerge. 2 days later, a long, rumbling flatbed truck, the kind you'd expect to see hauling something large and possibly dangerous, pulled into my quiet cul-de-sac. The truck was old, splattered with mud from a dozen different states, and emblazoned with a faded logo of a grinning clown. Big Top Bonanza Rentals. 2 men hopped out of the cab. They were a study in contrasts. The first, who I assumed was Gus from the phone call, was short, stout, and chewing on an unlit cigarillo. He wore a stained baseball cap and a look of profound boredom. The second, a lanky man named Fitz, was all limbs and wiry energy, with a nervous twitch in his left eye. They looked less like tent installers and more like 2 guys who had just escaped from a witness protection program. They were perfect. Gus ambled up my driveway, his eyes scanning my meticulously manicured lawn, then the house, then Carol's house. He took a long, slow look around the neighborhood, a place where the wildest thing to happen was usually a misplaced recycling bin. All right, he said, his voice gravelly. So this is the place? He gestured vaguely with his cigarillo. Where's the elephant entrance? No elephants, I said, trying to keep a straight face. We're just going for maximum visual impact, preferably centered on that house right there. I pointed a thumb at Carol's. Fitz's twitchy eye seemed to focus. A slow, knowing grin spread across his face. Ah, he said, his voice a conspiratorial rasp. A spite tent. We've done a few of those. Nothing this big, though. This here is the divorcee's revenge package, usually. First time we've seen it used for a neighbor dispute. There's a first time for everything, I said. The process of unloading and setting up the tent was a public spectacle of the highest order. Gus and Fitz worked with the practiced, efficient movements of men who had done this 1,000 times. They barked orders at each other in a language that seemed to be equal parts English and Carney slang. Giant canvas tarps, thick as sails, were unfurled across my lawn, completely smothering the grass Carol had once measured with a ruler. Heavy wooden poles were laid out. A massive generator was unloaded with a deafening thud. This was not a quiet operation. The noise of their work, the clang of metal stakes being sorted, the rhythmic thwump, thwump, thwump of a sledgehammer driving the first stake into the ground, Fitz shouting, "Give it some juice, Gus!" was a beautiful symphony of suburban disruption. Windows started to open. Curtains began to twitch. My neighbors, accustomed to nothing louder than the gentle hum of a leaf blower, emerged onto their porches with looks of bewildered curiosity. Mr. Henderson from down the street, who was once fined for having a pink flamingo in his garden, gave me a confused but intrigued look. The teenagers across the way started filming with their phones. And then there was Carol. She appeared at her window, her face a perfect mask of confusion. She watched as the first pole was raised. She watched as the giant red and yellow canvas was hooked on. Her confusion slowly morphed into disbelief, her mouth hanging slightly open. The main event was raising the center pole. Gus operated a small gas-powered winch, and the massive tent began to rise from the ground like a mythical beast. It was slow, majestic, and utterly, magnificently absurd. It rose higher and higher, a colossal fabric middle finger to architectural cohesion. It crested the top of my one-story house, its peak soaring into the sky, casting a glorious striped shadow directly over Carol's prize-winning petunias. From her window, I could see Carol's face transition through the final stages of grief. Disbelief turned to dawning horror. Horror turned to sputtering rage. Her face went from its usual beige to a deep, alarming shade of crimson. She disappeared from the window, and I knew with the certainty of a man who has just poked a bear with a very large stick that my phone would be ringing any second. Gus and Fitz finished their work, driving the last stake into the ground with a final, satisfying thud. They wiped their hands on their jeans and surveyed their creation. The tent dominated my entire backyard. It was a riot of color in a sea of monochrome. It was beautiful. "There she is," Gus said, finally taking the cigarillo out of his mouth. 140-foot spite tent, fully installed. She ain't going nowhere for 90 days. He turned to me and clapped me on the shoulder. "Good luck, kid. You're gonna need it." The silence that followed the departure of the big-top Bonanza truck was heavier and more menacing than the noise that had preceded it. The cul-de-sac was still. My neighbors had retreated into their homes, whispering and wondering. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The giant, striped tent sat in my backyard, a silent, cheerful behemoth, radiating pure chaos. It took exactly 4 minutes. My phone buzzed, the screen flashing with a name I didn't have saved but knew all too well. Neighbor, do not answer. It was my personal classification for Carol's number. This time, however, I was ready. I hit accept and put the phone on speaker. "Leo!" The shriek that erupted from my phone was so high-pitched, I was worried it might shatter glass. "What is that thing?" "Hello, Carol," I said, my voice a placid sea of calm. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Don't you hello Carol me. You know exactly what I'm talking about. There is a carnival tent in your yard. This is a flagrant violation of every rule in the book. I'm looking at the bylaws right now. This is turning our neighborhood into a freak show." I took a sip of the lemonade I'd prepared for this exact moment. "Actually, Carol, if you'll direct your attention to page 247, Article 9, Section 2, you'll find that temporary structures for private events are permitted for a period of up to 90 days without board approval. I'm hosting a private event." There was a sputtering on the other end, the sound of a woman whose entire world view was crumbling around her. A 90-day event? That's not an event, that's an occupation. I'm calling the police." "You do that," I said sweetly. "Have a wonderful day." I hung up before she could shriek again. I had just enough time to grab my secret weapon, a laminated copy of Article 9, Section 2, before I saw the flashing lights. 2 police cruisers, lights blazing but sirens off, pulled silently into the cul-de-sac. They parked right in front of my house. This was it, the main event. 2 officers got out. The first was older, with a weary face that suggested he'd seen every form of human stupidity and was profoundly unimpressed by all of them. This was Officer Miller. The second was younger, with a sharp uniform and an expression that was struggling and failing to remain serious. This was Officer Chen. Carol was already on her lawn, pointing a trembling finger at the tent as if it had just landed from outer space. "Officers! Thank goodness you're here! Arrest that man! He's erected a public nuisance!" Officer Miller sighed the sigh of a man who was 3 years from retirement and had already started counting the days. He walked up my driveway, his partner a step behind him. "Good evening, sir," he said, his voice a tired monotone. "I'm Officer Miller. This is Officer Chen. We got a call about, well," he gestured vaguely toward my backyard, "about the circus." "Good evening, officers," I said politely, holding up my laminated sheet. "It's a temporary structure for a private event, fully compliant with the Homeowners Association Covenant, Article 9, Section 2. I have a copy right here for you, and the rental permit from the company." I handed the sheet to Officer Miller. He took it, his eyebrows raising slightly at the lamination. Officer Chen peered over his shoulder to read it, and I saw his mouth twitch. He turned his head to the side, pretending to look at something down the street, but I could see his shoulders shaking slightly. He was trying not to laugh. Officer Miller read the paragraph, then read it again. He looked at the tent. He looked at my house. He looked at Carol, who was practically vibrating with righteous indignation on her lawn. He let out another, even deeper sigh. "Ma'am," he called over to Carol, walking to the edge of my lawn. "As far as we can tell, no laws are being broken here. There's no city ordinance against a temporary tent on private property as long as it's not a business." "It's a public nuisance," Carol screeched, marching over. "It's blocking my son. It's attracting carnies. It's a blight on our community. It's a civil issue, ma'am," Officer Miller cut her off, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This is between you, him, and your HOA. It's not a police matter." By now, the spectacle had drawn an audience. The curtain twitchers had become porch standers. Mr. Henderson, the pink flamingo guy, was leaning on his mailbox, watching with a huge grin on his face. The teenagers from across the street were now on their lawn, openly filming the whole thing. A few other neighbors had trickled out, drawn by the flashing lights. My little cul-de-sac was turning into a spectator sport. One of the teenagers, a girl named Maya, yelled out, "That is the sickest thing I've ever seen! Go, Mr. Martinez!" This seemed to break the dam. Mr. Henderson gave me a solid thumbs up. Another neighbor, a young woman who Carol had once cited for having too many different colored flowers in her garden, started clapping. The tide was turning. This wasn't just my fight anymore. The video Maya was filming, I would later learn, was already being uploaded to TikTok with the caption, "My neighbor Carol is a total Karen and got mad about a treehouse, so my other neighbor built a literal circus tent in his yard, #Hoa Wars, #Karen, #malicious compliance, #legend. It would have 50,000 views by morning. Seeing my growing army of supporters, I knew it was time to make my move. This wasn't just about defense anymore. It was time to go on the offensive. I walked back into my garage and emerged a moment later with a string of colorful pennant flags and a Bluetooth speaker. I started stringing the flags from the front of the tent to my house, a defiant act of carnivalesque decoration. I turned on the speaker, and the cheerful, bombastic melody of circus music filled the air. With a small crowd now gathered on the various lawns, I climbed onto my own front porch and cleared my throat. "Attention, residents of Crestwood Bluffs," I announced, my voice booming with newfound confidence. "I know there's been some confusion about the new addition to my property. This is simply the venue for a private, 90-day-long event celebrating community and freedom from beige oppression." A few people laughed. Carol looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. "And to kick things off," I continued, a brilliant idea blooming in my mind, "I'd like to formally invite all of you to the first annual Crestwood Bluffs Community Circus and Barbecue this Saturday. Come one, come all! Free hot dogs for anyone who's ever received a violation notice from the HOA." A cheer went up from my supporters. Mr. Henderson pumped his fist in the air. The teenagers whooped. Officer Chen had completely given up on professionalism and was now openly laughing, trying to disguise it as a cough. Officer Miller just shook his head, a ghost of a smile on his face. He handed my laminated sheet back to me. "Have a good night, sir," he said, tipping his hat. "Try to keep the noise down." He and Chen walked back to their cruisers. As they drove away, Officer Chen gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of respect. The battle was over. The war, I knew, was just beginning. But for the first time, I felt like I wasn't fighting it alone. I was the general of a growing army of the disgruntled, and our war tent stood tall and proud in the heart of enemy territory. The night after the great police standoff was eerily quiet. The circus music was off, the neighbors had retreated, and the big top stood silent in my backyard, illuminated by the soft glow of my porch light. It looked both menacing and deeply, deeply silly. I found myself sitting on my back steps, just staring at it, wondering if I had finally, completely lost my mind. I was in the middle of this existential crisis when Dave showed up, a six-pack of craft beer under his arm, and a grin so wide it looked like it was going to split his face. "I saw the video," he said, not even bothering with a hello. He just pointed at the tent. It's more magnificent than I ever could have imagined. It's like a cathedral of pettiness. I'm so proud of you." He handed me a beer and sat down next to me. "So the cops just left?" "Pretty much," I said, taking a long sip. "Told Carol it was a civil issue. I think one of them was my biggest fan." "Dude, you're a local legend. My buddy who lives 2 towns over sent me the TikTok. You're circus tent guy now. You've achieved suburban immortality." We sat there for a while, drinking in a comfortable silence, just marveling at the sheer audacity of the thing. But a part of me was still on edge. Carol wasn't the type to give up. She was probably in her house right now, poring over the HOA covenant with a magnifying glass, looking for a loophole to my loophole. A sneak attack felt imminent. My paranoia was interrupted by a soft knock on my back gate. Dave and I both tensed up. I half expected to see Carol standing there with a pitchfork. I cautiously opened the gate. Standing on the other side was Mr. Henderson, the Flamingo aficionado. He was a small, quiet man in his late 60s, who I'd only ever exchanged pleasantries with. He was holding a jumbo pack of hot dog buns. "Evening, Leo," he said, a shy smile on his face. I just wanted to say, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen on this street." He thrust the hot dog buns at me. "An offering. For the cause." "Mr. Henderson?" "Jim. Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. "You don't have to do this." "Oh, I do," he said, his eyes glinting. "That woman made me get rid of a plastic bird, Leo. A perfectly delightful pink flamingo named Ferdinand. She said he lowered the collective dignity of the block. After that, I swore if anyone ever stood up to her, I'd be the first to back their play." He then handed me a thick manila folder. "My complete HOA violation file. For your records. Might be some useful intel in there." Jim Henderson was the first to cross the line, but he wasn't the last. Over the next 2 days, my quiet cul-de-sac transformed. It was like I had inadvertently started a suburban resistance movement. The young couple from the corner house, the ones with the too whimsical garden, dropped off a cooler of sodas for the party. A retired woman whose bird feeder had been deemed a rodent attraction hazard brought over a stack of paper plates and told me, with tears in her eyes, that I was a hero. My phone buzzed with texts from numbers I didn't recognize. "Go get 'em, circus tent guy," one read. "We're with you," said another. I was getting screenshots of the neighborhood Facebook group where a civil war was brewing between the pro-Carol Preserve Our Property Values faction and my growing band of rebels who had unofficially named themselves the Crestwood Liberation Front. We had our first official War Council meeting on Thursday night, huddled under the big top like a group of revolutionary conspirators. It was me, Dave, Jim Henderson, and the whimsical garden couple, Sarah and Tom. We sat in lawn chairs, planning the barbecue on a whiteboard. It was no longer just a party. It was a political rally, a declaration of independence. Of course, the Empire was preparing to strike back. On Friday morning, I received an email. The sender was Wilkins, Abernathy & Finch, a law firm with an address in a fancy downtown high-rise. The subject line read, "Urgent. Cease and desist regarding property at 124 Primrose Lane." My blood ran cold. This was the sneak attack I'd been waiting for. The email was 5 pages of dense, intimidating legalese. It accused me of creating a hostile aesthetic environment, of willfully diminishing the established character of the community, and of operating a quasi-commercial nuisance. It threatened injunctions, lawsuits, and financial repercussions that would make the $50 a day fine look like pocket change. It demanded the immediate removal of the offending structure. My confidence wavered. These were lawyers. This was real. For a moment, I thought about calling Gus and Fitz and telling them to come take the tent down. Maybe this had all gone too far. I immediately forwarded the email to my war council. The response was swift. Jim Henderson called me, his voice steady. "Don't you dare panic, Leo," he said. "This is a scare tactic. All bark, no bite. Let me make a call." It turned out Jim Henderson's daughter wasn't just a lawyer. She was a partner at a competing high-rise law firm who specialized in contract and property law. And, as luck would have it, she had a long-standing professional rivalry with Abernathy from Wilkins, Abernathy & Finch. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Jim. "Okay, I just got off the phone with Jennifer," he said, and I could hear the triumph in his voice. "She says it's complete and utter bluster. Hot air. As long as you aren't charging admission, selling anything, or living in the tent, you're not operating a business. They have no legal grounds to force you to take it down. She said, and I quote, 'Abernathy is a windbag who bullies people with scary-sounding letters.' She's already drafting a response for you, pro bono. She said it's the most fun she's had all year." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. The alliance was holding. We had legal firepower. We had hot dog buns. We were going to win. Carol had tried to isolate me. Instead, she had united a neighborhood. She thought she was the queen, but it turns out she was just a bully ruling over a kingdom that was secretly sick and tired of being told what color to paint their birdhouses. The barbecue on Saturday was no longer just a party. It was a victory celebration. Saturday arrived, bright and sunny, as if the weather itself had joined our rebellion. My backyard was no longer just a backyard. It was a festival ground. The big top stood proudly, its stripes looking even more vibrant in the sunlight. Next to it, someone had anonymously donated a bouncy castle overnight. A glorious, inflatable dragon that was, I noted with glee, also technically a temporary structure. Dave was manning a massive grill, a cloud of delicious smoke billowing around him. Jim Henderson was directing traffic, showing people where to put their potluck dishes on a series of folding tables. Sarah and Tom had used their whimsical gardening skills to decorate the tent with strings of solar-powered fairy lights. The circus music was back on, playing at a respectable, non-ordinance-violating volume. And people came. Oh, did they come? It started as a trickle, then became a flood. My little cul-de-sac was filled with neighbors I'd only ever waved at. They brought pasta salad, they brought bags of chips, they brought their kids and their dogs. They brought their own HOA horror stories. I spent an hour just listening to tales of woe. The man who was fined for a crack in his driveway, the family reprimanded because their daughter's chalk art was unapproved graffiti. The woman whose holiday decorations were deemed excessively festive. Under the shade of the big top, we were a community forged in the fires of petty tyranny. Kids were going wild in the bouncy castle. Teenagers were taking endless selfies. Adults were laughing, eating, and commiserating. It was loud, it was chaotic, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in Crestwood Bluffs. My niece Penny was in her element, wearing a top hat I'd bought her and acting as the official ringmaster, leading the other kids in games of tag inside the tent. I stood on my deck, a paper plate loaded with a hot dog and 3 different kinds of pasta salad, and just watched. I had done this. I had started all this with a ridiculous, spite-fueled idea, and it had turned into something genuinely wonderful. Around 3 o'clock, a hush fell over the party. A delegation was approaching. It was the HOA board. All of them, the knitting woman, the 2 blank-faced ones, even the formerly sleeping man, were walking tentatively up my driveway. They were led by the board's vice president, a man named Gerald, a different Gerald, not Carol's spice-sensitive husband, who looked like he'd rather be undergoing a root canal. Carol, notably, was absent. She was watching from her window, a lone, defeated figure. They stopped at the edge of my lawn, looking deeply uncomfortable amidst the joyful chaos. I walked over to meet them, my heart pounding. This was the final showdown. "Leo," Gerald began, wringing his hands. We need to talk." "I'm listening," I said, taking a deliberate bite of my hot dog. "Look," he said, gesturing at the party, at the happy faces, at the inflatable dragon. This has gotten out of hand. The board has had a long discussion. We've received over 30 official complaints this week. About Carol." My eyebrows shot up. "It seems your demonstration has emboldened people," he continued, sweating under the afternoon sun. "We're prepared to offer a truce." I crossed my arms, waiting. "If you agree to take down the structure after your party today, well before the 90 days are up, the board is prepared to make an official exception. We will grant you a special variance to rebuild your treehouse to its original specifications." He swallowed hard. "Furthermore, we will be holding a formal review of Miss Peterson's conduct as board president." It was everything I wanted. Complete and total victory. The treehouse would live again. The queen was about to be deposed. I should have said yes immediately, but where was the fun in that? I don't know, Gerald, I said, tapping my chin thoughtfully. Penny's really enjoying her 90-day birthday party. We were just starting to plan the trapeze act. Panic flashed in Gerald's eyes. Please, Leo, we'll put it in writing. A formal variance, a guarantee. A mischievous idea sparked in my mind. I looked down at my plate. All right, Gerald, you've got a deal. I held out my paper plate and a Sharpie I had in my pocket. Put it in writing, right here. He stared at the plate, then at me. He knew I was messing with him, but he also knew he was in no position to argue. With a sigh of utter defeat, in front of God and all my rebellious neighbors, the vice president of the Crestwood Bluffs HOA leaned down and wrote out a contract on a Chinette paper plate. It promised me my treehouse and a review of Carol's reign of terror. He signed it with a flourish. The moment he handed it to me, the entire party, which had been shamelessly eavesdropping, erupted in a massive cheer. It was the sound of liberation. A few weeks later, the circus tent was gone, returned to the good people at Big Top Bonanza. In its place, the Fortress of Splinters 2.0 was nearing completion. Dave and I were securing the final roof panel, using the wood I'd carefully saved. Penny was inside, happily decorating the walls with new crayon drawings. I glanced over at Carol's house. A big red and white sign was hammered into her perfect, regulation height lawn. It read, "For sale." I grinned, picking up a hammer. As I looked up at my niece, safe and happy in her castle in the sky, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had fought the law, their law, and I had won. You know, I said to Dave, loud enough for Penny to hear, I think this whole ordeal taught me a valuable lesson about community and rules, and standing up for what you believe in. I hammered in a nail with a satisfying thwack. Best part, though, I just heard the new neighbors who put in an offer have a teenage son. Apparently he plays the drums.